I'm Nicola Tallant and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts. Back when Gerry Hutch was a boy, things must have seemed a lot simpler on Dublin's inner city streets. Yes, there was grinding poverty, slum housing and little chance of ordinary folk ever rising above the hand they'd been dealt. But it was a world that Gerry Hutch understood. For even in the dark belly of the criminal underworld, there was a pecking order that people followed and respected. Of course, there were those who stepped out of line and they were dealt with, sometimes in the most brutal fashion imaginable. But for the most part, things ticked along smoothly enough. Those involved in criminality planned their robberies and heists as quietly and covertly as possible. The less people who knew the details, the better. And most of those around them turned a blind eye as to how they raised their cash, often grateful for the financial boost a local area might get after a particularly big windfall. Everyone knew where they stood, and there was order. It might not have been lawful, and certainly the victims of these crimes, which involved a lot of armed robbery, were often severely traumatised. But compared with what was to come, it must now seem like a far quieter and a more gentle time. This is the story of Gerry the Monk Hutch, from his early days as a young hoodlum through to his astonishing acquittal in the Special Criminal Court. How did this quiet-spoken man from the North Inner City become one of the most notorious figures in Irish criminal history? How did he end up on trial for murder, and why did he walk free? It's a story about blood bonds, bitter feuds, and shocking betrayal. It's a story about the changing face of Dublin and about the pursuit of justice in the courts and on the streets. The Monk is a 4-part Crime World long read, produced by Ian Mullaney and read by me, Nicola Tallant. Part 3, Dublin Underworld. Hutch, the Gardaí have always believed, was an integral cog within the domain of organised crime, which first started to emerge in Dublin in the 1970s. Up in the north, with the outbreak of the Troubles, armed bank robberies had become a popular way for the Provisional IRA to fund their activities. And possibly inspired by these audacious heists, criminals in the south began to look at hitting security vans and financial institutions as a quick way to make a lot of money. Indeed, by the early 70s, the Dublin Central Detective Unit had established that Martin the General Cahill and his brothers had teamed up with the notorious Dunn gang in Crumlin to rob security vans after they'd made their collections from the banks. They got even more brazen. In 1983, Cahill and his gang stole £2 million worth of gold and diamonds from O'Connor's Jewellers in Harold's Cross. 3 years later, they struck again, helping to steal some of the world's most valuable paintings from Russborough House in County Wicklow. Other crime families operating around that time included brothers John and Michael Cunningham, experts at armed robberies who famously branched into kidnapping when they abducted the heiress Jennifer Guinness in 1986. And, of course, right there in the middle of this nefarious mix was Gerry Hutch. Although he has repeatedly claimed to have quit crime after his last stint in prison in the early 80s, Gardaí believe he was at the forefront of Ireland's gangland scene for at least another 2 decades. He's also claimed never to have been involved in drugs, hating heroin because of what it had done to his local community. He never took them or sold them, he has declared on numerous occasions. But the Gardaí have long doubted that he steered totally clear of this very lucrative industry. Selling drugs has been the main way to make lots of cash for a very long time. The market here was kicked off by Larry Dunn, who flooded the streets of Dublin with heroin, a scourge that almost wiped out entire communities and left thousands of addicts dead in its wake. Originally from the Liberties, Dunn's family later moved out to Crumlin and they made their living selling clothes from a stall in the Francis Street market. One of 10 brothers, Dunn was a thief from an early age and spent much of his youth in and out of industrial schools and prisons both in Ireland and the UK. For a time, he specialised in armed robberies. Then, with a few of his brothers, he got into selling cannabis. But after the Russian invasion of Afghanistan and the revolution in Iran, the European drugs market was suddenly flooded with heroin, and Larry Dunn saw his opportunity to make some serious cash. Smack, as it became known, was a lot more expensive and infinitely more addictive than hash, making the profit margins a lot more attractive. Using contacts he'd made in prison in England, he began to source consignments to bring to Ireland. He also revolutionised the way dealing was done in Dublin, organising groups of youngsters into runners who sold heroin on the streets and in various flat complexes. He never handled the goods himself, earning himself the nickname Larry Doesn't Carry. By 1982, he'd made so much money that he was able to buy himself a huge house on acres of land in Sandyford in South Dublin, with uninterrupted views of the Dublin mountains. There was no way the other major criminals were going to let Dunn have a market this size to himself. And it swiftly spread across Ireland, and by the 1990s, so-called recreational drugs like ecstasy had become popular with swathes of Irish society, from the working classes right up to professionals of all ages. The drugs business swelled again during the Celtic Tiger years, when cocaine became the drug of choice. Suddenly, among a large coterie of very ordinary Irish people, it became almost acceptable to buy grams of coke for a big night out. As the market boomed, it also became a lot more competitive, with a lot more at stake. Long-time dealers were finding themselves being forced out or undercut by those who wanted in on the action. And it all got very savage very fast. The violence was exasperated with the use of guns, once a rare enough tool in Irish gangland activity, brought out only for the bank or security jobs. Guns were starting to become commonplace, handed out to anyone willing to use them. Larry Dunn was finally caught with enough drugs to send him down for a long time, and after a dramatic court escape, he was extradited back to Ireland in 1985 to start a 14-year prison sentence. It made no difference to the supply chain. There were already a host of other criminals busy importing and selling to a burgeoning drugs market. For instance, John Gilligan was working his way up to become one of the most prolific, not to mention violent, drug barons in the country. He's also thought to have changed the way organised crime worked here by using a well-structured business distribution and financial plan. The pint-sized thug was infamously acquitted of being involved in the murder of crime journalist Veronica Guerin, but he was later jailed for 17 years for importing cannabis. He's due back in a Spanish court soon, where he faces another possible 3-year prison sentence for sending drugs back to Ireland by post. So, Ger, how is John Gilligan looking? John Gilligan, well, I discovered today was wearing the same suit that he'd worn in 2016. I hadn't picked up on that one, but he's doing okay for a guy that was arrested, and we saw the video of him being arrested in October, I think it was, 2020. He's still out on bail. He's obviously still enjoying the Spanish sun, and he's feeling pretty confident about this case against him. Yeah, I mean, prosecutor in the initial indictment or in the indictment that's been presented in front of the courts is asking for a 8.5-year jail sentence on full conviction, which is a long time in prison for a 70-year-old man. But I think he knows, and probably the state prosecutor is acutely aware that the chances of him getting that sort of sentence are it's fairly remote. There's a deal on the table, I believe, of 3 years. But by far the most notable of Ireland's drug dealers is Christy the Dapper Don Kinahan, who ruthlessly and relentlessly built up his empire before attempting to hand it over to his sons with devastating consequences. From the start, Kinahan was an unusual player in this world. Born in 1957, his mother owned and ran a successful B&B at their large period red brick home in Cabra on Dublin's north side, while his dad had driven a taxi based out of a busy city centre rank. One of 4 kids, he was the only boy, and the family was comfortable and well respected in their local area. But by the time he'd reached his 20s, Kinahan had come to the attention of the Gardaí. His interaction with the Hutch family first began with the monk's older brother, Eddie, who was a low-level criminal robbing delivery trucks and breaking into warehouses. Kinahan's middle-class accent and natty wardrobe, which earned him his nickname of the Dapper Don, made him useful for cashing fake checks or posing as a salesman offloading stolen goods on unsuspecting retailers. One of his first forays into the drugs business didn't end too well. In 1986, he was picked up in Clontarf with almost £120,000 worth of heroin, a huge amount at the time, and he was jailed for 6 years. His stint inside didn't put him off, and once released, his life of crime continued. There were more jail terms for fraud, in between setting up his own drug-dealing gang in Dublin. And like the monk, he made the best possible use of his time behind bars, studying for 2 degrees. One well-told story about him is how he refused early release at one stage so that he could finish one of the degrees. It's also been claimed that he learned 2 languages, Spanish and Russian, which, if true, was undoubtedly a huge help when it came to his international drug-dealing career. By around 2000, he'd moved to Spain, and it's from here he built up his cartel for the next 15 years, sourcing huge amounts of cocaine to sell to the Irish and the UK markets. Not only does he have an unusual background compared to the other main players in Ireland's crime world, but he also had an unusual habit of being publicly vocal about his political beliefs, and for a long time he was active on social media, in particular on LinkedIn, promoting his theories as well as his aviation consultancy business. We were able to discover the online presence of Christy the Dapper Don Kinahan. Total case of he hasn't gone away, you know.
No, absolutely. It was a very busy week, busy skiing for you, but particularly busy for us back in headquarters. But Christy Kinahan Sr., I suppose we've heard over the last few years how he stepped away from the business, and that's a lot of what we've heard about him. But I think the last few weeks have shown that while he may not be involved in the day-to-day of drug shipments, that he remains the mastermind behind the financial plan for the Kinahan cartel's assets.
He's this aviation broker. He has a LinkedIn page. You and I were able to read through his tweets, his LinkedIn postings, and other social media he had, and we got a proper insight into the kind of what was going on in his mind. He is pretty much pro-Vladimir Putin. He loves Russia. He thinks we should be a bit wary of Ukraine. He likes Claire Daly, the MEP, and her thoughts. And he's big into Russell Brand.
Yeah, I mean, it's a funny mix. I mean, I'll defend him slightly that his pro-Putin tweets kind of came before the invasion, actually.
For a number of years, Kinahan was married to his childhood sweetheart, Jean Boylan. They had 2 children together, Daniel and Christopher Jr., before splitting up. Like all good sons, his followed him into business, and it's with them that the tide of Irish gangland really turned, leading to the bloodiest feud this country has ever seen, and which in turn led to Gerry Hutch's arrest for murder in a Spanish restaurant in August 2021.
So he was in Dubai, and you could probably trace the Sunday World from sometime between 2015 and 2020. You have less and less Christy Sr. and more Daniel. And that's the way it went. Yeah. I mean, Daniel became the unwilling public face maybe of the Kinahan cartel. And Christy, we heard rumours, so he might have health problems. He's playing a lot of golf was another thing you're always told.
But he had sort of gone into the background, and we were kind of getting more and more into the mind of Daniel, who was like very clearly a bit of an egomaniac, a bit of a narcissistic guy, manipulative. He had sort of, fallen out with a lot of friends. There was people, enemies of his, who had a lot to say about him. But in the middle of that, and the truth of it was probably that he was this very egotistical person.
Yeah, he was putting himself forward, Daniel. I mean, it wasn't that you had to search for what he thought, because he had people saying it for him. Yeah. Boxers, other people coming out publicly, so you knew what was going on with Daniel.
He was going to be the power broker of boxing in the world, and that was his ambition, really.
Yes, and he seems to have made his own contacts, probably with the younger generation of criminals across Europe that Daniel was dealing with directly. Obviously from Holland, from Eastern Europe and stuff like that. But while Daniel was maybe doing that, like, amazingly, you know, because if you sit down and Google Christopher Kinahan, I mean, I don't know how many thousands and thousands of entries you get now. But simultaneously to that existing, Christopher Kinahan Senior seems to have set himself up as just he hasn't even renamed himself. No. He's just chopped off his last name, Kinahan, and just called himself Christopher Vincent, and has had a very relatively public life as, he describes himself online as a senior consultant, an aviation broker, in those sort of roles, with his own headshot on LinkedIn, amazingly, a recognisable face, which again he didn't have to do. Christopher Vincent, which is, even the middle name Vincent has been published many times, and he's out there on LinkedIn, social media, on a daily basis.
And he's been there, and he's been in the background, pretty much heading up the operation, really. From the financial point of view, as we said, Daniel is looking after the drugs, and I remember the Spanish called it difficult decisions being murder and various things like that. It was very, maybe Google Translate came up with it, but given how small Ireland is, it's not surprising there was overlap within some of the crime families. For a time, Gerry Hutch's nephew, Gary, was deeply involved in the Kinahan gang. Some say he acted as Daniel Kinahan's right-hand man. For all his adult life, Gary was a violent criminal, suspected of carrying out several murders and charged with attempted murder. In 2001, he was jailed for 6 years for his role in a vicious armed robbery from a house in Malahide. The thieves brandishing shotguns broke into the bedroom of a businessman and his wife, forcing them to open their safe, and got away with £32,000 worth of jewellery and £5,000 in cash. After his release, he spent most of his time in Spain, where he worked in the drugs trade. But he came back to Ireland for the big jobs. Like a tiger kidnapping in 2010, when a bank official was taken from his home in County Kildare and forced to go to the vaults in the Bank of Ireland on College Green in Dublin. The kidnappers threatened to attack his girlfriend's family if he didn't follow their instructions, and they stole €7.6 million. Most of it was never recovered, and it's believed Gerry Hutch used his share from the heist to invest in a drug shipment organised by the Kinahans. But his investment didn't work out, and it's after this Gary sought to exact his revenge by going after Daniel Kinahan. But he botched the shooting and effectively signed his own death warrant. It didn't help that rumours were swirling around the place that Gary was feeding information about the Kinahans' operations to Gardaí. And it's unlikely that he was a snitch, but the Hutch family knew he was in danger and spent months negotiating with Daniel Kinahan and his associates to try and persuade them not to kill him. They eventually struck a deal, and it was agreed that the Hutches would pay the Kinahans a six-figure sum, thought to be around €200,000, and that Gary would step away from the drugs trade for good. Believing that he was now safe from harm, he returned to Spain to live. But the Kinahans double-crossed him, and in September 2015, the 34-year-old was shot dead by his one-time pal, James Frizzy Quinn, beside a swimming pool at an apartment complex near Marbella on the Costa del Sol. Quinn is now serving a 22-year sentence in a Spanish jail. Gary's death was the catalyst of everything that followed, and if Gerry Hutch had hoped to avoid getting involved, it was made impossible for him when 3 months later, in December 2015, he was lucky enough to avoid being assassinated himself. 2 men in balaclavas burst into a pub on his beloved Lanzarote just minutes after he had left. There was no choice. A line had been drawn in the sand, and the Kinahans could not be allowed to get away with it. What happened next would change everything.
Of course, for any journalist, you do want to be there when things are happening, but when when bullets are flying and guns are being pointed at you, it kind of changes your perspective on that a wee bit. Yeah, well, myself and Ernie drove out to the Regency. I suppose we got there quite early. The weigh-in wasn't due to happen till around 2:30. We'd been there for a little bit beforehand, and we parked at various different spots just in the car park outside the Regency and driving up by the Regency, and took a few different pictures of some of the people. There was a few of the Kinahan kind of associates had gone in. We'd got a few pictures of them. David Byrne had gone in, Liam Byrne had gone in.
Did you see David Byrne, going in?
Yeah, I think Ernie should have a picture of him going in. I think that we got before, obviously, Liam Rowe, people like that. There was a few different people that we'd know and we'd recognise from the Sunday World that were there. So we were basically just there taking pictures, seeing who was there.
You weren't going to go in then, like it was more the point.
No, I popped in briefly. I was only in there probably for a minute or two. I know the Evening Herald were there at the same time, and Robin Schiller was in more in the room itself just before the shooting took place. But no, myself and Ernie were mostly outside, kind of circling around different positions outside just to see who's coming and going, trying to spot the different people. The easiest place to do that really was on the door because they all had to come out generally the same door, and they were mostly coming out the front entrance.
So what happened? What sort of time of day was it? It was 2:00ish?
It was about 2:30. Well, we'd been there from beforehand, and we took those pictures, so that had all happened. Just before 2:30 is when things really kicked off. By that stage, we were parked just at Seven Oaks. It's an estate in almost the grounds of the Regency. It's a kind of complex there. There's a centre across from it. There's the Regency and then a little estate. So we were facing towards the centre there. We could see people walking by past us. And at that stage, we just heard a loud bang. And both turned to each other. Given what the event was, a loud bang like that obviously draws your concern. So we were about to start moving around the corner after hearing the bang when we were just seeing a load of people come flying by, running out towards the Swords Road. Some of them were on foot. There was people jumping in cars and speeding away at high speed mounting different paths as they were on the way. That all happened quite quickly. We came around the corner then. You're talking only a few metres around the corner, and we spotted a grey van and pulled up outside the entrance to the hotel. There was a person in the van who seemed to be armed with an assault rifle, and there were people to the right of the van kind of almost tripping over, falling over and running, trying to get into bushes which were to the side opposite the hotel, and the weapon was being pointed at them.
So the driver of the van had the weapon?
It seemed that way, yeah, from our perspective, at some stage the driver of the van had a weapon, because from the angle it looked like from where we were sitting behind it, a weapon seemed to come around from the driver's door towards us.
From the very start, Gerry Hutch was a formal suspect for the Regency Gun Attack, a meticulously and daring attempted hit on Daniel Kinahan, which missed him by a mere seconds. It's clear the Kinahan gang were also certain of who was behind the ambush, and 3 days later, the monk's brother Eddie Hutch, an innocent taxi driver, was gunned down at his flat on the North Strand in Dublin. A few weeks later, one of Gerry Hutch's best friends, Noel King-Size Duggan, was shot dead while sitting in a car at the Old Mill housing estate in Rathoath in County Meath. It's been reported that around this time, senior Gardaí went to Hutch to ask if there was any possibility of trying to negotiate with the Kinahans again, in an effort to end the bloodshed. By this stage, 5 men were dead. Gary Hutch, Darren Kearns, who was shot in December 2015, David Byrne, Eddie Hutch and Noel Duggan. Gerry Hutch refused to even consider any kind of mediation. Things had gone too far. According to one crime source, he simply told Gardaí, "There's no going back. I've nothing to lose." Over the next 2 years, 13 more men would die, the vast majority of them killed by the Kinahan gang. Given the extent and ferociousness of the bloodshed, it's not surprising that 2 of the dead were innocent victims, caught in the crossfire of this bloody and senseless feud. Trevor O'Neill, a Dublin City Council worker, was shot dead in Mallorca on a family holiday with his wife and young children in August 2016, after he was mistaken for a member of the Hutch family. while 24-year-old Martin O'Rourke was killed on Sheriff Street in Dublin in April 2016 after being shot in the back of the head by a stray bullet during an attempted hit on a Hutch family associate. In the meantime, the Gardaí investigation into the Regency murder, one of the most high-profile criminal events in this country, was going full throttle. At one point, Gerry Hutch's nephew, Patrick, who was alleged to have been the gunman dressed up as a woman, complete with a long blonde wig, was arrested and charged with murder, but the court case was sensationally dropped in 2019 after the sudden death of lead investigator, the Detective Superintendent Colm Fox in Ballymun Garda Station. During all this time, Gerry Hutch was on the run, having fled Ireland shortly after his conversation with the Gardaí. Not only did he have the Kinahans to worry about, but the guards were determined to get him too. And in April 2021, they finally got their European arrest warrant after the Director of Public Prosecutions ordered that Hutch be charged with David Byrne's murder. It took 4 more months before he was arrested in a restaurant in Fungarola by Spanish police. On the 29th of September 2021, he was flown by military aircraft from Madrid to Casement Aerodrome by the Irish Defence Forces and was taken straight to a special criminal court where he was formally charged with Byrne's murder. It was 36 years since he'd seen the inside of a jail cell, and for the next 2 years, he must have spent countless hours brooding over how he'd ended up back in one, over who exactly had betrayed him and what exactly they had said. When his trial finally started in November 2022, he started getting all of those answers. The Monk is a 4-part Crime World long read produced by Ian Mullaney and read by me, Nicola Tallant. Crime World is a podcast from SundayWorld.com.